law, although it has a very old history, that is teaching of law certainly in European universities as well as in the US, is often taught as a technical subject. Here are the rules, here are the statutes, here are the decisions that the court has made. But law is all about social behavior. It's all about how people will respond to social norms and also to legal norms, which are incorporated in the law, so that policymakers at different levels at every time of history have had goals of how they think people should behave, what would be good for society and for the community and for economic productivity, etc. And there are assumptions underlying the rules that they adopt to reach those goals. But historically, law has rarely questioned those assumptions. They're people's social intuitions, and we now know from research in the social sciences, and particularly in cognitive psychology, that people's human intuitions are frequently, although not always, wrong. And so those of us who do what has now come to be called empirical legal studies or empirical legal research, we say, what are we trying to achieve here? What's the purpose of this rule? What are the underlying assumptions that may not have been made explicit? And then how could we study whether those assumptions are actually correct? And to do that kind of research, it's usually the case that you want to use one or more social science research methods, whether it's sociology, cultural anthropology, economics, or perhaps looking backwards, history. Globalization of the economy has clearly changed the nature of transactions that people engage in. And a good deal of the law is about economic transactions, either deals in the course of business or other associated activities, mergers and acquisitions, investments, etc. So in all of our countries, those kinds of transactions used to take place within our own country's borders. And except on rare occasions, for example, in the shipping industry, there were always people going all over the world. So we had a kind of special category of law for those circumstances, but they were regarded as the exception. And most of what was taught, and most of what is still taught all over the world, including in the US, in law schools, is each country's law. Of course, here in Europe, you have to learn each country's law plus European Union law, but our students learn national federal law, and then they may also learn the law of the state that they think they will practice in. So the area I teach in focuses on what happens when deals go wrong and there are disputes, and people are now going to need to settle those disputes. And today, that deal crossed borders, and so that dispute is going to cross borders. And so my students, who will mostly be headquartered and working in the US, need to understand that this kind of dispute, which might be dealt with in a particular way in the States, is going to be dealt with in a different way in Germany. And if they are representing a US headquartered company that is doing business in Germany, that part of the advice that they need to be able to give their client is advice about, well, how does the German system work? How do the courts work here? And of course, I'm giving a very simple example because we now have many, many disputes where there may be businesses in Canada, in Europe, in Asia, in the States. And now there's some very difficult dispute that needs to be sorted out. And it's going to involve the courts and the legal rules of all those different countries. So increasingly, American law schools are trying to bring some of that understanding and some of that knowledge into class. Of course, that's very hard. We can't make law school take a lifetime. So I would say it's affecting the way many, if not all of us, think about what we're teaching, but in a concrete sense, in my view, it's a kind of slow process of opening up people's minds. We don't have a tradition of undergraduate education in law, so I don't have the experience of working with undergraduate students. I've thought a little during this visit to Leuphana, if I were in a college system like this, what would I want to teach students? I think the most important thing is I would want them to understand the kinds of problems that law exists to address. I've already mentioned one of them, deals that are made. How does law affect that? How can we think about contracts and agreements between parties? And what should we do when something goes wrong subsequently? But of course, there are issues of families. How should we think about the issue of what families own together, what couples own, what their responsibilities are to each other, to their children, what happens if the marriage breaks up. So I think at the undergraduate level, because the students are not going to go out and practice law, and indeed in Germany they cannot because they have to take these two state exams, rather than teach the rules, I think that the education would best be focused on the underlying concepts and the choices that need to be made. So at least in my view, there's no one right choice. And often within a society, there's great debate among different groups within that society as to what should be the proper rule. And I think for undergraduates, you want them to understand what's at stake, what are the different ideas that people would bring to bear in trying to sort out that problem. And of course, since I am, as you said, an empiricist, and I try and bring empirical thinking and methods into my own teaching, I would also think it's useful for undergraduates to be exposed to the question of, okay, here are all these questions we've been discussing in class. How would we find out what the answers are? And that's where empirical methods come in. So I think that certainly at Stanford, my home institution, we think we are training people to have certain skills, a certain approach to analysis, the ability to think hard and precisely about difficult questions and difficult problems. And if you have that kind of ability and training and ultimately expertise, you can bring that to bear in myriad occupations and career paths. And in fact, I have been saying, I've been asked to speak about this, and I've been asked, well, what advice would I give a young law student who's trying to figure out what her career should be? And my advice is that over the span of your career, for your students as well as for mine, they're likely to work in many different organizations. They may have different roles within those organizations. So a law student who is certified to work as a lawyer might be a lawyer in a large firm, perhaps in Frankfurt. They might be a lawyer in a small firm in a nice small city like Lüneburg, where they might have a very different kind of career. They might though not be a lawyer at all in the sense of formally practicing law. They might actually be a business person making business decisions, but they're informed by their legal thinking. And increasingly, and I think this is relevant for your students here at Leuphana, and it's certainly our students think that it's relevant, they might be starting their own businesses. So we have law students who are now taking classes with computer science students, and the law student says, well, I know there's a problem that perhaps people with low incomes or perhaps immigrants have this particular kind of problem. It's very expensive for them to find a lawyer, so we'll design an app for them, and we'll work with their friends in the computer science course. And then, just as you have an incubator on the Stanford campus, they'll go find our startup program, which is a student-run startup program. So all my students now think they're going to do startups, not go to big firms. I think that for the students particularly who are law students, I think the old-fashioned way of teaching law as a bunch of rules, knowing how the courts would decide a particular case, etc. The kind of material that is tested in Germany on the state exams and in the US on what we call the bar admission exam. You need that information, particularly if you're going to start out practicing as a law, but it's such a tiny percentage of what you really need to know. So I think anyone who is going to be a lawyer ought to be taking at least one or perhaps more courses in cognitive psychology. How do people think about problems? What are the biases people bring to problems? How do people analyze risk? The whole field of decision making under uncertainty and risk, that's what every business person is doing. And of course, it's what many of us are doing in our more ordinary personal lives. I am saying to my dean that we ought to be teaching our law students how to do computer coding, that the digitization and computers are more and more important in law as in other areas, and that if our students go out really understanding these technologies, even if they themselves don't have the skills to be computer science engineers, they will be much more valuable whether they're in a business or a large firm or even their own firm, because they'll have an understanding of the technologies and maybe a chance to keep up with the technologies. So my kind of set of skills and knowledge would include some of the traditional knowledge. Philosophy has always been a strong basis for the development of law. History, how have different societies dealt with this, cultural anthropology, psychology, economics. So I think that we ought to be training lawyers with broad, multidisciplinary theoretical perspectives, and I think we ought to teach them, if not themselves how to do empirical research, how to understand and assess other people's empirical research. So I think it's a much broader agenda, and of course that's very challenging because many people, including faculty members who were trained in traditional legal education, including faculty members who are colleagues of mine, think, well, how could you do all that? Because we already have too much to do. So I think some of this broader thinking needs to displace some of the more traditional ways of thinking about teaching law.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. You're welcome.